before Norman Bates gripped that knife, his shadow looming in a shower of steam, before Leatherface roared to life, his chainsaw screaming, his mask a grotesque patchwork of human skin, before Buffalo Bill whispered his chilling desires, stitching nightmares in a basement of dread, there was Ed Gein, a quiet, unassuming farm boy from the frozen heart of Wisconsin, hiding a secret so depraved it would sear itself into the soul of a nation, a secret that would echo through decades of horror. This wasn't just a man who killed. This was a man who turned death into a grotesque gallery, who wove unspeakable nightmares from the flesh and bones of the dead, whose silent, crumbling farmhouse held a darkness so profound it birthed the monsters that still haunt our screens, our dreams, our deepest fears. In the desolate fields of Plainfield, Ed Gein crafted a legacy of terror that no one could have predicted. Not his neighbors, who saw him as a harmless oddball, not the police, who stumbled into his world by chance, not even himself, a man lost in a mind where love and horror became one. His secret wasn't just buried in the graves he robbed or the bodies he claimed. It was etched in the silence of a soul that saw the dead as something to be worn, to be cherished, to be kept forever. This is the story of a man whose quiet madness became Hollywood's loudest scream, a story that will grip you, unsettle you, and force you to question what lies behind the faces we trust. Stay with us, because what investigators uncovered inside that decaying farmhouse didn't just shock a small town, it changed the course of horror history, giving life to the icons that make us lock our doors, check our windows, and wonder what's hiding in the shadows of the ordinary. This is Ed Gein, the butcher whose crimes didn't just break the world, they reshaped it. Ed Gein wasn't born a monster, but the world he grew up in seemed hell-bent on forging one, planting seeds of darkness in a boy too fragile, too isolated to resist their pull. Born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse, Wisconsin, Edward Theodore Gein was the younger of two sons in a family defined by fear, control, and a suffocating devotion to a warped moral code. His mother, Augusta Gein, was a towering, unyielding presence, a fiercely religious woman whose fanatical Lutheran faith cast the world as a battlefield of sin, a place where every stranger was a predator, every desire a one-way ticket to eternal torment. Augusta preached endlessly to Ed and his older brother Henry, her voice a relentless hammer, pounding in warnings of hellfire, lust, and the depravity of humanity. She read them gruesome Bible passages, tales of divine wrath, severed heads, and burning flesh, her eyes blazing with conviction, her words painting women as temptresses, men as beasts, and her sons as fragile souls she alone could save. She forbade friendships, scorned the idea of romance, and kept her boys tethered to her side, their lives a narrow path of chores, prayers, and fear. The family's farm in Plainfield, 40 acres of barren fields and hardscrabble labor, was their fortress, a place where Augusta's word was law, her disapproval a punishment worse than any beating. Ed's father, George, was a hollow figure, a weak, alcoholic drifter who worked odd jobs, carpentry, tanning, whatever paid for his whiskey, and withered under Augusta's dominance. George's temper flared in drunken rages, his fists landing on Ed or Henry when the bottle emptied, but his presence was fleeting, his love non-existent, leaving Ed starved for affection, clinging to the only source he knew, his mother. Augusta called Ed her good boy, praised his quiet obedience, and he drank it in, desperate for her approval, her voice filling the voids where confidence, identity, or hope might have grown. Ed worshipped her, saw her as his protector, his guide, his entire world, her warnings about the filth beyond the farm sinking deep into his psyche. At school, he was an outcast, mocked for his slight frame, his mumbled speech, his odd habit of giggling at nothing. his eyes darting as if expecting punishment. Teachers noted his intelligence. He loved reading adventure stories, tales of pirates and far-off lands, but saw a boy adrift, lost in daydreams, unable to connect with peers who called him Weird Eddie. He'd run home to Augusta, her arms a refuge, her lectures a confirmation that the world was as cruel as she said. When George died of a heart attack in 1940, the family barely mourned. Augusta's grip tightened, her sermons grew fiercer, and Ed, now 34, stayed glued to her side, a grown man with the emotional maturity of a child. Henry, for years older, began to push back, questioning Augusta's control, urging Ed to break free, to live beyond her shadow. In May 1944, Henry died in a bizarre brush fire on the farm, his body found pinned under a fallen log, his lungs unburned despite the flames, suggesting he was dead before the fire started. Ed, who'd been with him, claimed it was an accident, a spark from a brush pile gone wild. The coroner ruled no foul play, the town too small, too trusting to dig deeper. But whispers lingered. Had Ed silenced a brother who dared to challenge their mother's hold, who threatened the cocoon of her love? A year later, in December 1945, Augusta suffered a stroke and died, leaving Ed, at 39, utterly alone, a man-child unmoored in a world he'd been taught to fear, his anchor gone, his mind fracturing under the weight of her absence. Her death didn't just break him, it shattered him, leaving a void that grew ravenous, a hunger that twisted his grief into obsession. He boarded up her bedroom like a sacred shrine. Her floral dresses hung neatly, her Bible open to Revelation, her scent of lavender and starch clinging to the air. He moved to the kitchen, living in squalor as the rest of the house fell to ruin, his days a blur of farm chores and silence. But the silence wasn't empty. It was alive with Augusta's voice, her warnings, her commands, echoing in his head, demanding he keep her close, keep her alive. Ed began devouring books on anatomy, taxidermy, even accounts of Nazi experiments and tribal rituals, his mind fixating on the body, on preservation, on defying the finality of death. The farm became his cocoon, the isolation his accomplice, as he slipped into a darkness that would soon spill over into the graves of Plainfield, a darkness that would redefine horror for the world. How does a boy so shy, so devoted, become a ghoul who defiles the dead? Was it Augusta's dogma, her voice a ghost in his mind, urging him to reclaim her? Was it the farm's crushing solitude, a world with no one to pull him back? Or was something broken in Ed from the start, a fault line in his soul, waiting for her death to crack wide open, to unleash a madness that saw the dead not as gone, but as his to possess, to transform, to love? Ed Gein's descent into horror began not with blood, but with earth, not with murder, but with theft, a theft so unthinkable it turned the quiet cemeteries of Plainfield into his personal vault. By 1947, 2 years after Augusta's death, his grief had curdled into something grotesque, her absence a wound he tried to stitch shut with the bodies of others. He started haunting graveyards at night, drawn to the fresh mounds of middle-aged women, women whose obituaries he clipped meticulously from the Plainfield Sun, their black and white photos studied in the dim light of his kitchen. These women, with their stern faces and sturdy frames, echoed Augusta in his fractured mind. Her authority, her presence, her untouchable power. Armed with a shovel, a pry bar, and a warped resolve, he'd dig under the cover of moonlight. The only sounds the scrape of dirt, the creak of coffin lids, his shallow breaths fogging in the cold Wisconsin air. He didn't take entire bodies at first, just parts, pieces he could carry in burlap sacks back to his farmhouse, a sagging, gray relic on a lonely road, its windows boarded, its walls hiding a growing nightmare. There, in the flickering glow of kerosene lamps, surrounded by stacks of yellowed pulp magazines, rusted tools, and the stench of mildew. Ed became a craftsman of the macabre. He dissected his stolen corpses with a hunter's precision, using knives honed on the farm, preserving their skin with salt, their bones with care, their essence in ways that defied sanity, that mocked the natural order. He wasn't driven by rage, by lust, or by voices commanding slaughter. He was driven by need, a desperate, delusional need to recreate, to possess, to keep the dead alive in his world, to fill the void Augusta left. He sewed their skin into patches, boiled their skulls clean, experimented with their remains like a taxidermist chasing perfection. For nearly a decade, he lived among his creations, his secrets safe in a town too small, too trusting to suspect the man who waved from his porch, who fixed their fences, who babysat their kids. But in 1954, his hunger escalated, his rituals demanding more than the dead could give. Mary Hogan, a 54-year-old tavern owner in Pine Grove, 7 miles from Plainfield, vanished from her bar on December 8, 1954. A pool of blood stained the floor. A .32 caliber cartridge glinted nearby. But no body, no witnesses, no leads. Locals whispered about mob hits, a jealous lover, or Hogan's rough crowd. But the case went cold, her fate a mystery that hung over the county like a fog. Ed, who'd sat quietly at her bar, nursing beers and watching her with his nervous smile, later admitted to shooting her with a pistol, dragging her body to his farm, her broad shoulders and commanding voice too close to Augusta's to resist. For 3 years, her disappearance remained unsolved, her skull hidden among Gein's collection, her life reduced to another piece in his grotesque puzzle. Then, on November 16, 1957, Bernice Wardens, a 58-year-old widow who ran Plainfield's only hardware store, disappeared during a slow Saturday morning. A bloodstain marked the shop floor, cash register untouched. A receipt for antifreeze bore Ed Gein's name, and the town's quiet trust began to crack like ice under weight. That evening, Sheriff Art Schley and his deputies drove to Gein's farm, expecting a petty thief. A misunderstanding at worst. What they found was a nightmare that words could barely capture, a horror that would sear itself into their minds forever. In a shed behind the house, Bernice Warden's body hung upside down from a crossbeam, good like a deer, her head severed, her chest cavity hollowed out, her heart sizzling in a cast-iron pan on the kitchen stove, the smell of charred flesh mingling with the house's reek of decay. The deputies gagged, their flashlights trembling as they stepped inside the farmhouse, their boots sticking to floors caked with grime. The air was thick, heavy with the stench of death, the room's a labyrinth of filth and madness. What they uncovered would haunt them for life. Lampshades crafted from human skin, stretched taut and glowing a sickly yellow under bare bulbs, their texture like parchment. A belt studded with human nipples, their edges curled like grotesque beads, glinting in the dim light. Chairs upholstered with flesh, the seams hand-stitched with fishing line, creaking as if still alive. A shoebox filled with dried noses, their cartilage brittle, rattling like pebbles. Soup bowls carved from skulls, polished to a dull sheen, stacked neatly on a shelf beside chipped ceramic plates. A corset made from a woman's torso, its ribs removed, its skin soft as tanned leather, laced up the back. A suit of skin, complete with breasts and hips, sewn to fit Ed's slight frame, hung on a wooden hook like a costume waiting for its wearer, its surface mottled with scars. And the masks, 9 of them, human faces peeled from corpses, their eyes hollow sockets, their lips sewn shut with coarse thread, pinned to the walls like silent witnesses, their expressions frozen in death's quiet scream, some with traces of lipstick, as if Ed had adorned them. A 1957 police report quoted Deputy Frank Warden's, Bernice's son, choking out, "I saw my mother's face, staring at me from that wall, empty but hers." Officers vomited in the yard. Others stood frozen, their minds refusing to process the scene, their hands shaking as they catalogued the unthinkable. It was like stepping into hell. Sheriff Schley told the Milwaukee Journal days later, his voice hollow, his eyes distant. Gein's collection came from at least 9 graves, plus Hogan and Warden's, their bodies transformed into objects of devotion, a twisted attempt to resurrect Augusta, to wear her, to become her. He admitted to dancing in a skin suit under the moon, wearing the masks, calling it his ceremony, a ritual to feel his mother's presence, her voice alive in his head. He'd sit in his flesh-upholstered chair, eating from a skull bowl, surrounded by his creations, as if they were family, as if they could fill the silence she left. His crimes weren't frenzied, weren't sexual in the typical sense. They were deliberate, methodical, a labor of love born in a mind where death was not an end, but a beginning, where flesh was clay, where the dead were his to keep. How could a man live among such horrors, eating from skull bowls, sleeping under blankets of skin, as if it were normal, as if it were home? What drove him to turn bodies into artifacts, to wear the dead like a second skin, believing it could bring his mother back, could make him whole? Why did Plainfield, a town of just 600 souls, miss the signs, the late-night trips to cemeteries, the stench wafting from his farm, the man who smiled too softly, who lingered too long? How many graves did he rob? How many lives did he desecrate before a single receipt betrayed him? And how long might he have continued, his darkness growing, had fate not intervened? The investigation into Ed Gein began with a single, unremarkable clue, a receipt for antifreeze, scribbled with his name, left on the counter of Bernice Warden's hardware store on November 16th, 1957. It was a cold Saturday, the day after she vanished, and her son, Deputy Frank Warden's, found the bloodstain on the shop floor, a crimson smear that chilled him, the cash register untouched, the receipt an arrow pointing to Ed Gein, a regular customer known for his odd, nervous smile, his habit of lingering to chat about nothing. Sheriff Art Schley, a gruff veteran of Plainfield's small, 6-man force, didn't expect much, just a possible theft, maybe a drifter passing through, a misunderstanding at worst. But instinct, honed by years in a town where secrets were rare, led him to Gein's farm, a decaying 40-acre sprawl on the town's edge, its clapboard walls peeling like dead skin, its yard a graveyard of rusted cars, broken plows, and tangled barbed wire. As dusk fell, Schley and his deputies approached, their boots crunching on frozen grass, their breath visible in the November chill, unaware they were about to uncover a horror that would echo across the world, a horror that would redefine what evil could be. In a shed behind the house, they found Bernice Warden's body, hung upside down from a crossbeam like a slaughtered animal, gutted from throat to pelvis, her head severed, her chest cavity hollowed out, her heart sizzling in a cast-iron pan on the kitchen stove, the smell of charred flesh mingling with the house's reek of decay and neglect. The deputies gagged, one retching into the snow, their flashlights trembling as they stepped inside the farmhouse, their boots sticking to floors caked with years of grime, grease, and something darker. The air was thick, heavy with the stench of death, the room's a labyrinth of filth, stacks of moldy newspapers, empty tin cans, broken furniture, and something worse, something that made their skin crawl before they even saw it. What they uncovered would scar them forever, would steal sleep from men who'd seen war, who thought they knew the worst of humanity. Lampshades crafted from human skin, stretched taut and glowing a sickly yellow under bare bulbs, their texture like cracked parchment, veined and translucent, a belt studded with human nipples, their edges curled like grotesque beads, glinting in the dim light. Its buckle rusted, chairs upholstered with flesh, the seams hand-stitched with fishing line, creaking as, if still alive, their armrests worn from use, a shoebox filled with dried noses, their cartilage brittle, rattling like pebbles when shaken, soup bowls carved from skulls, polished to a dull sheen, stacked neatly on a shelf beside chipped ceramic plates, as if Gein ate from them daily. A corset made from a woman's torso, its ribs removed, its skin soft as tanned leather, laced up the back like a grotesque gown. A suit of skin, complete with breasts and hips, sewn to fit Ed's slight, 140-pound frame, hung on a wooden hook like a costume waiting for its wearer, its surface mottled with scars, its stitching crude but deliberate, and the masks, 9 of them, human faces peeled from corpses, their eyes hollow sockets, their lips sewn shut with coarse thread, pinned to the walls like silent witnesses, their expressions frozen in death's quiet scream, some with traces of lipstick or rouge, as if it had adorned them, had tried to make them beautiful. A 1957 police report quoted Deputy Frank Warden's, Bernice's son, choking out, "I saw my mother's face, staring at me from that wall, empty but hers, like she was still there but gone." Officers vomited in the yard. Others stood frozen, their minds refusing to process the scene, their hands shaking as they catalogued the unthinkable, their voices hushed as if speaking louder might wake the horrors around them. "It was like stepping into hell," Sheriff Schley told the Milwaukee Journal days later, his voice hollow, his eyes distant, his hands still trembling when he recounted the night. Gein was arrested hours later, found sitting quietly in a neighbor's house, sipping coffee, his slight frame and soft, almost childlike voice jarring against the atrocities tied to his name. During questioning at the Washara County Jail, he spoke with eerie calm, as if recounting a dream, his hands folded neatly, his eyes occasionally darting to the ceiling, as if listening to someone unseen. "I wanted to know what they were like," he said of the bodies, admitting to robbing graves since 1947, targeting women who resembled his mother, middle-aged, stout, authoritative, whose obituaries he studied like the collector. He confessed to killing Mary Hogan on December 8, 1954, shooting her with the .32 caliber pistol at her tavern, dragging her body to his farm, her skull later found in a burlap sack. He admitted to killing Bernice Wardens, shooting her with a .22 rifle, her body prepared for his work. He claimed Augusta's voice guided him, urged him to collect, to preserve, to honor her memory, to keep her with me. A 1957 interrogation transcript notes his tears when speaking of his mother, calling her the only one who ever understood me, the only one who ever loved me. His detachment otherwise chilling, his eyes distant, like a child explaining a broken toy, unaware of its weight. Police scoured local cemeteries, Hancock, Spiritland, Plainfield, finding disturbed graves, some empty, their headstones askew, their soil freshly turned, confirming Gein's confessions of at least 9 thefts, perhaps more. Evidence piled up. A .22 rifle in his kitchen matched the bullet in Warden's store. Hogan's skull, identified by dental records, sat in a box. Skin fragments matched descriptions of missing women from obituary photos. A ledger in Gein's bedroom listed grave dates, names, and items taken. Plainfield reeled. Neighbors who'd called Ed harmless, who'd hired him to fix their barns, to watch their children, now locked their doors, their trust shattered, their memories tainted. He was just Eddie. A local farmer, Elmer Shea, told the Wisconsin State Journal. Always polite, always alone, always a little off, but never this. The trial began November 21st, 1957. but Gein's mental state dominated, his soft-spoken demeanor clashing with the horrors he'd wrought. Psychiatrists from the Central State Hospital diagnosed schizophrenia, paranoia, and necrophilia, describing a man lost in delusions, his psyche splintered by Augusta's death, his crimes a warped attempt to reunite with her, to wear her, to become her. In January 1958, Judge Herbert A. Bunn declared him legally insane, unfit for trial, and committed him to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Waupun, a sprawling brick facility for Wisconsin's most broken minds. A 1968 retrial, after a decade of treatment, found him guilty of Bernice Worden's murder, but insane at the time of the crime, returning him to the asylum, his sentence a life of confinement rather than death. Charges for Hogan's murder and the grave robbing were dropped, the legal system overwhelmed by his fractured mind, unable to reconcile justice with madness. His farm, deemed a house of evil by the Plainfield Sun, was torched by locals in March 1958, its ashes a futile attempt to erase the stain, the fire drawing a crowd who watched in silence, their faces lit by flames, their relief mixed with dread. How did a single receipt unravel a horror no one could fathom, a horror that hid in plain sight for a decade? Why did Gein confess so readily, as if his secrets were a burden he longed to shed, a confession to a world he never understood, a world that never understood him? What does it mean when justice falters, when a monster's madness spares him from the gallows, leaving a town to grapple with its own blindness, its own failure to see the darkness in its midst? Ed Gein didn't just terrify a small Wisconsin town. He reshaped the landscape of horror, his crime seeping into the stories that define our deepest fears, birthing villains who stalk our nightmares, who live in the shadows of our collective psyche. His quiet madness became a blueprint for terror, a spark that ignited some of the most iconic works of fiction, transforming a reclusive grave robber into a cultural phantom whose influence endures. In 1959, Robert Bloch, a Wisconsin writer living just 100 miles from Plainfield, published Psycho, a novel inspired by Gein's case, which Alfred Hitchcock turned into a 1960 film that shattered cinematic boundaries. Norman Bates, the shy, stammering motel clerk with a domineering mother and a deadly secret, was Gein's echo, a man whose devotion to mother hid a fractured psyche, his murders a twisted act of loyalty, his isolation a mirror of Ed's lonely farm. Bloch, who'd read the Milwaukee Journal's coverage of Gein's arrest, drew on Ed's maternal obsession, his quiet demeanor, and the shock of a normal man hiding horrors, crafting a story that probed the mind's darkest corners. Gein showed us evil can wear a familiar face, Bloch said in a 1962 interview with the New York Times, a theme that made Psycho a cultural earthquake, its shower scene a touchstone of suspense, its exploration of split identities a revelation. In 1974, Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre unleashed Leatherface, a hulking, mute killer in a mask of human skin, his chainsaw a brutal nod to Gein's craftsmanship, his cannibal clan a grotesque exaggeration of Ed's solitary rituals, their farmhouse a warped reflection of Plainfield's house of horrors. Hooper, inspired by news reports of Gein's lampshades, masks, and skin suit, wanted to show the horror of what's behind closed doors. He told Fangoria in 1980, creating a gritty, visceral slasher that birthed a genre, its raw violence shocking audiences, its imagery searing itself into pop culture. In 1988, Thomas Harris published The Silence of the Lambs, adapted into a 1991 film that won 5 Oscars, introducing Buffalo Bill, a serial killer who skinned women to sew a woman's suit, a direct parallel to Gein's skin corsets and suits, his basement lair an echo of Ed's cluttered workshop. Harris, who'd studied FBI profiler files on Gein, wove Ed's methods into a villain whose quiet menace rivaled Hannibal Lecter's charisma. whose obsession with transformation mirrored Gein's delusional rituals. Director Jonathan Demme noted in a 1991 Rolling Stone interview, Gein's story was the seed. How someone so ordinary, so unremarkable, could harbor something so unthinkable, so alien. These films didn't just borrow from Gein. They mythologized him, turning a man who killed 2 and robbed 9 graves into an archetype of terror, a symbol of the monster next door, the evil that hides in plain sight. Psycho redefined psychological suspense. Its black and white dread making audiences scream in theaters, its influence spawning countless imitators. Chainsaw birthed the slasher genre, its low-budget terror proving horror could be raw, unrelenting, universal. Silence elevated serial killer narratives, blending psychological depth with visceral fear, its cat-and-mouse game between Clarice Starling and Lecter grounded by the chilling reality of Bill's Gein-inspired crimes. Gein's shadow stretched further. TV shows like Bates Motel, which reimagined Norman's youth, or American Horror Story, which nodded to Gein in its freak show season. Video games like Dead by Daylight, with killers wielding chainsaws. Comics like Hack/Slash, with slasher villains. Even heavy metal tracks like Mudvayne's Nothing to Gain. All traced back to that farmhouse, to those masks, to a man who never saw a movie but shaped an industry. His crimes tapped a primal fear, that evil isn't always loud, that it can live in the shy handyman who waves from his porch, who fixes your car, who watches your kids. Hollywood's obsession with Gein amplified his story, turning a small-town tragedy into a global myth, but at a cost. His victims, Mary Hogan and Bernice Wardens, faded into the background, their lives overshadowed by the villains they inspired, the names rarely spoken while Norman, Leatherface, and Bill became household words. Gein's influence grossed billions, packed theaters, and fueled a cultural fascination with serial killers, but it also blurred the line between reality and fiction, making his horrors feel like stories, not lives destroyed. Why did Gein, with a modest body count of 2, outshine prolific killers like Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, or John Wayne Gacy in shaping horror? His crimes a touchstone for creators across decades. How did his quiet, solitary madness become a canvas for stories that thrill, terrify, and captivate us? Stories that grossed billions while his victims' graves grew weeds. What is our love for these films, our thrill at Norman's knife, Leatherface's roar, Bill's dance in the mirror, say about our need to confront the darkness Gein unleashed, to stare into the abyss he carved from flesh and bone, to find meaning in the meaningless? And why do we keep returning to his story, as if it holds a truth we're afraid to face? Ed Gein died on July 26, 1984, at 77. In a sterile room at the Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison, Wisconsin, his heart failing quietly, his passing a whisper compared to the screams his crimes inspired. He was buried in Plainfield Cemetery, his grave unmarked to deter vandals, souvenir hunters, or the morbidly curious. His body returned to the earth he once defiled, laid to rest near his mother, the woman whose shadow defined him, consumed him, destroyed him. But his legacy endures, a shadow that stretches far beyond a burned-out farmhouse, far beyond the small town that tried to forget him, reaching into the silver screen, the pages of books, the nightmares of those who know his name. Gein wasn't a prolific killer. 2 confirmed murders, Mary Hogan and Bernice Wardens, possibly his brother Henry's death in 1944, and 9 graves robbed. But his impact dwarfs that of serial killers with dozens of victims, men like Bundy, Dahmer, or Gacy, whose body count shocked but whose methods didn't reshape culture the way Gein's did. Why? Because Gein didn't just take lives. He desecrated. He transformed. He lived in a world where the dead were his companions, his canvas, his comfort, crafting a horror so intimate, so visceral, It felt like a violation of humanity itself, a betrayal of the boundaries between life and death. His farmhouse, torched by Plainfield locals in March 1958 in a desperate bid to purge its evil, became a symbol of hidden terrors, a reminder that monsters don't always prowl city streets or shadowed alleys. They can fester in the quiet of rural America, in the places we call safe, unnoticed until their darkness spills out like blood. Popular culture seized Gein, turning him into the Mad Butcher, an archetype of the unhinged craftsman, the solitary ghoul, the man who makes monsters from the mundane. Books like Deviant by Harold Schechter, which dissected his psyche, or The Man Who Made Psycho by Robert Lindsay, which traced his influence, became true crime staples. Documentaries like Ed Gein, The Ghoul of Plainfield on A&E, or In the Light of the Moon on Discovery Channel drew millions, their grainy reenactments chilling viewers. Heavy metal songs, Slayer's Dead Skin Mask, with its lyrics about wearing faces, or Mudvayne's Nothing to Gain, with its raw anger, cemented his infamy, their riffs a tribute to his darkness. Podcasts like My Favorite Murder or Last Podcast on the Left devote hours to his case, their hosts balancing horror with humor, dissecting his masks, his lampshades, his skin suit. His story sparked debates about mental illness. Could schizophrenia, diagnosed by his doctors, explain his descent, or was he simply evil, a man who chose his path? About rural isolation, did Plainfield's smallness, its lack of scrutiny, hide him or enable him, letting him slip through the cracks? About upbringing, was Augusta Gein the true villain, her fanatical control, her toxic mix of love and fear, the spark that lit his madness? Psychologists point to her as a case study in pathological parenting, her suffocating dogma a blueprint for Ed's collapse, her voice a ghost that drove him to dig, to sow, to kill. Studies in the Journal of Forensic Psychiatry from the 1980s cited Gein as an example of necrophilic delusion, a mind where love for a lost parent twisted into desecration. Yet, Gein's legacy raises darker, more troubling questions. By making him a horror icon, have we glorified a killer, turning his atrocities into entertainment, his victims into props for our thrills, their pain a backdrop for our chills? Bernice Wardens, a kind widow who greeted every customer with a smile, who raised 2 sons alone after her husband's death. Mary Hogan, tough, brassy barkeep who poured drinks and traded jokes with loggers, her laughter a fixture in Pine Grove. The nameless women whose graves he violated, whose families never knew their rest was stolen. Why do their names fade, their stories untold, while Gein shines in neon, his horrors celebrated in theaters, on Netflix, in Halloween costumes? True crime fans dissect his creations, the belt of nipples, the corset of skin, the masks with their hollow eyes, but rarely linger on the lives he stole, the families he broke, the town he scarred. Gein's story forces us to confront the line between fascination and exploitation, between understanding a monster and feeding his myth. His influence lingers in every slasher flick, every true crime binge, every leather mask sold at Spirit Halloween. Each one a faint echo of his farmhouse, his rituals, his madness. Plainfield, now a quiet dot on Wisconsin's map, still carries a stain. Locals avoid his name, deflect questions with tight smiles, but tourists flock to the empty lot where his farm stood, snapping selfies, hunting ghosts, buying Gein Ghoul t-shirts at gas stations. The town's annual harvest festival, once a celebration, now draws true crime buffs, their cameras a reminder of a wound that never heals. Gein's unmarked grave is occasionally defaced, its soil stolen by collectors, a grim irony for a man who robbed graves himself. Why does Gein's shadow endure? More than Dahmer's, more than Gacy's, a man with so few kills, but such profound, unshakable horror. What is our obsession with his story, Our books, our films, our podcasts, our endless debates reveal about a society that can't look away from its darkest mirrors, that finds a strange comfort in the monsters it creates, that turns a butcher into a legend while his victims vanish into footnotes. What makes a monster? The mind, warped by voices only it can hear, whispering rituals of flesh and bone, crafting nightmares from the silence of a lonely farm. The mother, whose love was a prison of fear, her gospel of fire that burned her son's soul to ash, her shadow so vast it swallowed him whole. Or the mirror of a society that takes killers like Ed Gein and turned them into icons, their horrors reborn in every movie, every mask, every scream that thrills us in the dark, every story that makes us lean closer to the screen. Ed Gein was no mastermind, no charismatic predator, no figure of towering evil, just a broken man, a shy, mumbling loner whose quiet darkness reshaped how we see the world, how we see evil, how we see ourselves. He showed us that the worst horrors don't come from city streets, from shadowed alleys, or from strangers with wild eyes. They come from the places we call home, the people we think we know, the neighbors who wave, who smile, who hide their hell behind closed doors. His victims, Bernice Wardens, whose kindness lit up a hardware store, whose sons lost their anchor, Mary Hogan, whose laughter filled a tavern, whose absence left a void in Pine Grove, the women he stole from their graves, whose families never knew their peace was shattered, deserved better than to be footnotes in his madness, better than to be eclipsed by the myths we've spun from their pain, better than to be forgotten while Norman Bates, Leatherface, and Buffalo Bill live on in our stories, our screens, our fears. Their lives and gains force us to look at the shadows we'd rather ignore, the ones in crumbling farmhouses, in fractured minds, in the stories we tell to make sense of the senseless, to tame the terror of a world where a man can wear faces, can eat from skulls, can love his mother so fiercely he destroys her memory. Gein's legacy isn't just a warning, it's a challenge, to see the human cost of our fascination, to remember the lives behind the lampshades, the masks, the suits of skin, to question what we create when we turn monsters into legends, when we profit from their darkness, when we make their horrors our entertainment. His story asks us to draw a line between understanding evil and feeding it, between mourning the lost and glorifying the loser, between facing our fears and letting them define us. So, what do you think? Was Gein a product of his mother's grip, her voice a chain that bound him to madness? Was he a victim of his own sickness, a mind broken beyond repair? Or was he something deeper, a darkness we all carry in some small, silent corner, a potential we fear but can't stop probing? Where do we draw the line between studying a monster and celebrating him, between telling his story and exploiting it? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and we want to know what this descent into Gein's world stirred in you, what it made you fear, what it made you question, what it made you see in the mirror of his crimes. If this dive into the butcher's horrors left you chilled, heart pounding, mind racing with the line between man and monster, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and ring the bell for more true crime deep dives that unravel the minds behind the nightmares, that pull you into the shadows and refuse to let go, that challenge you to face the darkness within and without. Check out our videos on Jeffrey Dahmer, whose quiet charm hid a freezer of horrors, John Wayne Gacy, whose clown smile masked a crawlspace of death, Eileen Wuornos, whose rage carved a bloody path, or the unsolved Zodiac killings, whose ciphers still taunt us, for more stories that haunt, that challenge, that demand we confront the monsters among us. Share this with your true crime crew. Spark a debate. Keep the conversation alive, because Ed Gein's story isn't just history. It's a mirror, a warning, a call to confront the monsters we create, the ones we fear, the ones we can't stop watching, the ones that live in the quiet spaces we dare not look. Thanks for joining us. Stay curious and stay safe. I'll see you in the next one, where we chase another shadow, another truth, another monster hiding in plain sight, waiting for the world to turn its gaze his way.